The morning sun filtered through the tall windows of Rosewood Country Club, casting golden rectangles across the marble floor where Marcus Chen knelt, carefully arranging white rose petals in a perfect circle. His calloused hands, more accustomed to changing diapers and packing school lunches than crafting wedding displays, moved with surprising precision as he positioned each petal exactly 2 inches from the next. Somewhere in the distance, the wedding coordinator's sharp voice echoed through the ballroom, barking orders at the catering staff. Marcus had learned to tune out Vivian's constant demands during his 6 months working as her assistant. The pay wasn't much, but it was steady, and more importantly, it allowed him to be home every evening by 6 to help his 80-year-old son Danny with his physical therapy exercises. The irony wasn't lost on him. 5 years ago, he had been Dr. Marcus Chen, leading a team of pediatric occupational therapists at Children's Hospital. He had published papers on sensory integration techniques and spoken at conferences across the country. Now he spent his days folding napkins and polishing silverware, invisible to the wealthy guests who swept past him as if he were part of the furniture. But that was before Sarah's accident. Before the long nights in hospital waiting rooms and the crushing weight of medical bills. Before the decision to leave his career behind and focus entirely on Danny, who needed him more than any research paper or professional accolade ever could. Marcus stood slowly, his knees protesting after 20 minutes on the cold floor. At 34, his body already carried the evidence of manual labor and sleepless nights. His dark hair was beginning to show threads of silver at the temples, and his once soft hands now bore the calluses of a man who had learned to fix broken things with determination rather than money. The Rosewood Country Club buzzed with the organized chaos that preceded every high society wedding. Today's event was particularly grand, celebrating the marriage of Amanda Rothschild to some tech mogul whose name Marcus couldn't quite remember. What he did know was that the guest list read like a Fortune 500 directory, and Vivian had been particularly demanding all week, reminding everyone that this wedding could make or break their reputation. As Marcus gathered his supplies to move to the next table arrangement, he caught sight of his reflection in one of the polished silver candlesticks. The man staring back at him wore the same face, but everything else had changed. The confident posture of a doctor had been replaced by the careful hunched shoulders of someone who had learned to make himself small, to blend into the background, to avoid drawing attention that might cost him his job. He thought of Danny, probably just waking up at Mrs. Rodriguez's house next door. His son would be struggling to button his shirt, his fine motor skills still developing despite years of therapy. Marcus had taught him to take his time, to be patient with his fingers that didn't always cooperate. Every morning, Danny would ask if today was the day his daddy would come back to helping other kids like him. Someday, Marcus always promised. When we have enough money saved. When things are more stable. The truth was more complicated, woven through with pride and fear and the simple reality that starting over at 34 felt impossibly daunting. The sound of expensive heels clicking across marble interrupted his thoughts. Vivian appeared at his elbow, her tablet clutched against her chest like armor. Her perfectly styled blonde hair didn't dare move despite her constant motion, and her smile had the brittle quality of someone who had practiced it in mirrors until it looked natural. She glanced at his rose petal circle with the quick, assessing eye of someone who found fault as easily as breathing. For a moment, Marcus held his breath, waiting for criticism. Instead, she gave a curt nod that might have been approval. The VIP guests will start arriving in 30 minutes, she announced, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had orchestrated hundreds of these events. The bride's family is already here, and I need you to focus on the ceremony space. Make sure every chair is perfectly aligned and check that the aisle runner is completely smooth. Marcus nodded, gathering his supplies once more. As he turned to leave, Vivian's voice stopped him. And Marcus, she added, her tone dropping to something almost confidential, today's guest list includes some very important people. The CEO of Meridian Industries will be here with his family. I need everything to be flawless. No mistakes, no drawing attention to yourself. Just blend in and do your job. The weight of her words settled on his shoulders like a familiar burden. In his former life, he had been the important person in the room, the one whose expertise mattered, whose opinion was sought. Now he was being reminded to remain invisible, to ensure that his presence didn't somehow diminish the perfection that wealthy people expected when they paid premium prices for their special moments. As he walked toward the ceremony space, Marcus caught glimpses of the early arriving guests through the tall windows. Luxury cars glided up the circular drive, depositing men in custom suits and women whose jewelry caught the morning light like captured stars. This was a different world from the modest neighborhood where he and Danny lived, where people measured success in grocery bills paid on time and children who laughed despite their challenges. But as he began the careful work of adjusting chair angles and smoothing fabric, Marcus found himself wondering about the people who would soon fill these seats. Behind all the wealth and status, they were still just people celebrating love, hoping for happiness, carrying their own invisible burdens and secret dreams. He thought of Danny again, and of the promise he had made to himself in those dark days after Sarah's death. He would do whatever it took to provide for his son, to give him every opportunity to thrive despite the obstacles life had placed in his path. If that meant folding napkins and arranging flowers instead of helping other children learn to navigate their world, then so be it. Where in the world are you listening to this story from right now? What time is it where you are? Whether you're starting your morning with coffee or winding down your evening, we're grateful you're here with us as Marcus begins what will become an extraordinary day. The ceremony space was taking shape under his careful attention, each detail perfect and ready to frame a moment that would be remembered for a lifetime. Marcus had no way of knowing that his own life was about to change in ways he couldn't imagine, that his quiet competence and hidden compassion were about to collide with a need he was uniquely qualified to meet. The first wave of guests began arriving as Marcus finished his final adjustments to the ceremony space. Through the French doors that opened onto the club's manicured gardens, he could see valets in crisp uniforms directing the parade of luxury vehicles. Mercedes, BMWs, and sleek Teslas glided past the fountain where stone angels poured endless streams of water into perfectly maintained pools. Marcus moved efficiently between his tasks, checking the sound system's volume levels and ensuring the floral arrangements hadn't shifted during transport. His movements had the fluid economy of someone who had learned to accomplish much while remaining largely unnoticed. It was a skill he had never needed as Dr. Chen, but one that had become essential as Marcus the wedding assistant. The first guests to enter were an elderly couple, the woman leaning heavily on a silver-handled cane while her husband guided her with gentle patience. Marcus watched them navigate the slight step up from the terrace, noting how the man automatically adjusted his pace to match his wife's careful movements. It was the kind of observation that came naturally to him, a professional habit that years of manual labor hadn't managed to erase. Behind them came a younger family, parents in their 40s followed by two teenagers who looked as though they'd rather be anywhere else. The mother wore a navy dress that probably cost more than Marcus made in 3 months, while the father checked his phone with the distracted air of someone whose mind was still in the office despite the weekend setting. But it was the third group that made Marcus pause in his inventory of chair cushions. A man in an impeccably tailored charcoal suit emerged from a black sedan, his silver hair catching the morning light. Even from a distance, there was something commanding about his presence, the way he carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone accustomed to being the most important person in any room. This had to be the CEO Vivian had mentioned. Marcus recognized the type from his hospital days, when pharmaceutical executives and medical device company presidents would visit the children's wing, their expensive suits and practiced smiles masking calculations about profit margins and market share. The man turned back toward the car, and Marcus saw him reach inside to help someone else emerge. A woman appeared first, elegant in pearl gray silk, her movements graceful despite what looked like recent recovery from some minor injury. She favored her left leg slightly as she stepped onto the club's stone pathway. Then came the third passenger, and Marcus felt his professional instincts sharpen with recognition. A girl, perhaps 10 or 11 years old, was carefully lifted from the car's back seat into a sleek wheelchair. Even from his distance, Marcus could see the expensive quality of the equipment, the kind of custom chair that cost more than most people's cars but provided independence that was priceless. The girl's dark hair was pulled back in an elaborate style that someone had clearly spent considerable time perfecting. Her dress was a miniature version of adult formal wear, complete with tiny pearls at the neckline. But it was her posture that caught Marcus's attention, the way she held herself with a dignity that seemed far beyond her years, as if she had already learned to navigate a world that didn't always make space for her. The CEO, whom Marcus now assumed was her father, bent down to say something to her. The girl nodded and smiled, an expression that transformed her serious face into something radiant. Her mother placed a gentle hand on her shoulder, and together the family began moving toward the club's entrance. Marcus found himself tracking their progress with the automatic assessment that had once been second nature in his work with children. The girl's upper body strength was clearly excellent, her arms working the wheelchair's push rims with practiced efficiency. Her parents flanked her but didn't hover, maintaining the careful balance between protection and independence that marked families who had learned to navigate disability with grace. As they approached the entrance, Marcus noticed something that made his chest tighten with familiar frustration. The other guests, so polished and socially conscious in every other way, seemed to develop a peculiar blindness when it came to the wheelchair. Conversations continued around the family as if they were invisible, eyes sliding past them with the practiced avoidance that able-bodied people often mistook for politeness. The girl noticed too. Marcus could see it in the slight straightening of her shoulders, the way her smile became more fixed and less spontaneous. She had learned, as children with disabilities often did, to recognize when she was being treated as an inconvenience or an object of pity rather than simply another person attending a wedding. Her father seemed oblivious to the subtle social dynamics, focused instead on ensuring his daughter's chair could navigate the slight incline leading to the terrace. Her mother, however, had the hyper-aware expression of someone who had spent years protecting her child from thoughtless cruelty while trying not to build walls that would limit her world. Marcus felt the familiar ache in his chest, the one that came whenever he witnessed the casual exclusion that children with special needs face daily. It was the same feeling that had driven him to specialize in pediatric therapy, the burning need to advocate for kids who deserved every opportunity to participate fully in life. He forced himself to return to his tasks, arranging programs on the gift table and double-checking that the Unity candle was properly positioned. But his awareness remained fixed on the family as they found their seats in the third row, the girl's wheelchair positioned at the end where it wouldn't block anyone's view. The ceremony space was filling now, conversations creating a gentle buzz of anticipation. Marcus moved through his final preparations with automatic precision, his hands busy while his mind catalogued the small details that others missed. The way conversation seemed to pause when the CEO's family walked past, then resume with slightly forced cheerfulness. The careful distance other guests maintained, as if disability might be contagious. Most painful of all was watching the girl herself adapt to these reactions with practiced grace, her smile never wavering even as she was repeatedly overlooked by adults who would have made a point of complimenting any other child's dress or hairstyle. The string quartet began their prelude as the last guests found their seats, the delicate notes of Pachelbel's canon floating across the garden terrace. Marcus positioned himself near the back of the ceremony space, his clipboard ready to address any last-minute issues that might arise. From this vantage point, he had a clear view of the assembled guests and could monitor both the musical cues and Vivian's increasingly frantic hand signals from her position near the altar. The bride's family occupied the first two rows on the left side, a collection of Philadelphia society matrons in pastels and their distinguished husbands in navy blazers. They carried themselves with the particular confidence of old money, the kind that didn't need to announce itself because everyone already knew. Conversations flowed in measured tones about charity galas and summer houses in the Hamptons. On the right side, the groom's family and business associates created a different energy entirely. These were tech industry titans and venture capitalists, their wealth newer but no less significant. Marcus recognized a few faces from magazine covers and business television programs, people whose decisions affected thousands of jobs and millions of dollars. The CEO's family sat quietly in the third row, the girl's wheelchair positioned with perfect precision at the aisle end. Marcus noticed how her father had chosen seats that would give her an unobstructed view while keeping her somewhat removed from the center of attention. It was a careful calculation, the kind that parents of children with disabilities learn to make instinctively. As the processional music began, Marcus watched the familiar choreography unfold. The officiant took his position, followed by the groom and his best man. Bridesmaids glided down the aisle in their coordinated steps, each carrying cascading bouquets of white roses and baby's breath. But his attention kept drifting to the girl in the wheelchair. She watched the proceedings with genuine interest, her hands folded neatly in her lap, occasionally leaning forward to get a better view when taller guests blocked her sight line. Her parents flanked her protectively, but Marcus could see the careful balance they were maintaining between inclusion and oversight. The bride appeared at the top of the aisle, radiant in silk and French lace, her father's arm steady beneath her white-gloved hand. The assembled guests rose as one, the rustle of expensive fabric and soft murmurs of admiration creating a gentle symphony of approval. All except one. The girl in the wheelchair remained seated, of course, but Marcus noticed something that made his chest tighten with familiar anger. Not a single person around her acknowledged her presence with a smile or a gentle touch that might have included her in this moment of shared joy. She might as well have been invisible, a piece of equipment rather than a child witnessing something magical. The ceremony proceeded with flawless precision. Vows were exchanged with voices that carried just enough emotion to seem genuine without appearing theatrical. Rings were presented on silk pillows that Marcus had personally polished until they gleamed. The unity candle was lit without incident, its flame steady in the still morning air. Throughout it all, Marcus found himself watching the subtle social dynamics that played out around the CEO's daughter. When the officiant asked the congregation to witness the couple's commitment, her clear voice joined the chorus of agreement, but the adults around her seemed not to hear it. When the bride and groom shared their first kiss as husband and wife, and spontaneous applause erupted from the guests, she clapped enthusiastically from her chair, but her celebration went unnoticed by those standing around her. It was during the recessional that Marcus witnessed something that made his professional heart ache. As the happy couple processed back down the aisle, the bride paused briefly near each row to smile at particularly important guests. When she reached the third row, her eyes passed directly over the girl in the wheelchair without the slightest acknowledgement, as if she were looking through empty air. The girl's smile never wavered, but Marcus saw the tiny moment of disappointment that flickered across her features before she carefully composed herself again. It was a reaction he had seen countless times in his former career, the practiced resilience that children with disabilities developed when facing a world that often forgot they existed. Her father noticed too. Marcus saw the CEO's jaw tighten almost imperceptibly, a flash of protective anger that was quickly controlled. Her mother's hand found her daughter's shoulder in a gesture that was both comfort and solidarity. As guests began rising from their seats and moving toward the cocktail reception area, Marcus watched the careful navigation that the family had to undertake. Other guests flowed around them in patterns that seemed natural but were actually elaborate avoidance dances, designed to maintain appropriate social distance without appearing openly rude. The girl handled it all with remarkable grace, maneuvering her wheelchair through the crowd with practiced skill while her parents created subtle paths for her. But Marcus could see the effort it required, the constant vigilance needed to navigate not just physical obstacles but social ones as well. Vivian appeared at his elbow, her tablet clutched against her chest like a shield. The ceremony was perfect, she announced, her voice carrying relief and pride in equal measure. Now we need to transition everyone to cocktails while the photographer captures family portraits. Make sure the bar stations are fully stocked and that the appetizer service begins exactly on schedule. Marcus nodded, gathering his supplies to move to the reception area. But as he turned to leave, he caught one more glimpse of the CEO's family making their way slowly through the crowd. The girl was pointing out details of the garden landscaping to her parents, her enthusiasm genuine despite the social isolation that surrounded her. In that moment, Marcus made a decision that would change everything. He couldn't remain invisible any longer, not when a child needed what he had spent years learning to provide. Professional instincts that had been dormant for years suddenly roared back to life, demanding action. The reception area beckoned with its perfectly arranged tables and gleaming crystal, but Marcus's attention remained focused on a little girl who deserved to be seen, to be included, to be celebrated for exactly who she was. The cocktail reception area hummed with the sophisticated energy of 200 guests sampling artisanal hors d'oeuvres and craft cocktails. Marcus moved efficiently between the serving stations, ensuring that silver trays remained filled with delicate canapés and that champagne flutes never sat empty for long. The catering staff worked with choreographed precision, their movements practiced and nearly invisible to the guests they served. From his position near the bar, Marcus could observe the natural clustering that occurred at these events. Business associates gravitated toward familiar faces, forming tight circles where deals were discussed over whispered conversations. Family members sought out distant relatives, catching up on children's achievements and vacation plans. The younger crowd, mostly the couple's college friends and junior colleagues, created their own energetic pocket near the garden entrance. But one figure remained consistently isolated. The CEO's daughter had positioned her wheelchair near a tall cocktail table where her parents could rest their drinks, but the careful distance other guests maintained around her created an invisible barrier that seemed to expand rather than contract as the reception progressed. Marcus watched her parents navigate the delicate social dance required at these gatherings. Her father was clearly an important figure, judging by the way other men approached him with deferential handshakes and eager smiles. Business cards were exchanged with subtle ceremony, and conversations carried the weight of significant financial implications. Her mother moved through different circles, gracefully accepting congratulations on her elegant appearance and engaging in the careful small talk that bound high society together. She spoke knowledgeably about the bride's family connections and shared amusing anecdotes about wedding preparations with other mothers who had survived similar ordeals. But throughout these interactions, their daughter remained peripheral, acknowledged only when someone made the obligatory comment about how lovely she looked or how well-behaved she was. These remarks carried the particular tone that adults used when speaking about children with disabilities, a mixture of pity and admiration that somehow managed to diminish rather than celebrate. The girl herself seemed accustomed to this pattern. She had developed the art of entertaining herself, studying the architectural details of the country club's ceiling or watching the servers move through their carefully choreographed routines. Occasionally she would catch her parents' attention and share an observation about the flowers or the music, her intelligence evident in the sophisticated vocabulary she used to describe what she noticed. Marcus found himself drawn to these moments of connection between the girl and her parents. There was genuine warmth and respect in their interactions, a family dynamic that spoke of love and acceptance despite the challenges they faced. Her father would lean down to hear her whispered comments, his face lighting up with pride at her insights. Her mother would smooth her hair with tender affection or adjust her shawl with the automatic care of long practice. It was during one of these tender family moments that Marcus witnessed something that made his hands clench around the serving tray he was carrying. A group of guests had clustered near the cocktail table where the family was positioned, their conversation growing animated as they discussed some business acquisition that had dominated recent financial news. As their circle expanded, they gradually crowded closer to the girl's wheelchair, their backs turned to her as they gestured enthusiastically about market projections and competitive advantages. What started as thoughtless positioning quickly became something more problematic as one man stepped backward to make room for another joining the conversation. The girl had to quickly maneuver her wheelchair to avoid being bumped, her movement sharp and defensive. Her parents were momentarily distracted by separate conversations and didn't immediately notice the encroachment. The business discussion continued without pause, the participants oblivious to the fact that they had effectively forced a child to retreat from her chosen position. Marcus felt his professional training surge to the surface, years of advocacy and protection instincts that had been carefully suppressed during his months of service work. He had seen this pattern countless times in hospital settings, where children with mobility challenges were treated as obstacles to navigate around rather than people deserving consideration and respect. Without conscious thought, Marcus found himself moving toward the situation. His training had taught him that intervention needed to be subtle but effective, addressing the problem without creating embarrassment or drawing unwanted attention to the child involved. He approached the group of businessmen with the practiced invisibility of service staff, carrying his tray of appetizers as natural camouflage. "Excuse me, gentlemen," he said in the polite but authoritative tone he had perfected during his hospital years, "I need to refresh the table settings in this area. Would you mind stepping back just a moment?" The men moved automatically, their conversation barely pausing as they relocated their discussion to a more appropriate distance. Marcus used the opportunity to position himself near the girl's wheelchair, ostensibly arranging napkins and cocktail plates but actually creating a buffer zone that would prevent further encroachment. The girl looked up at him with surprised recognition, her dark eyes intelligent and curious. She had noticed the careful choreography of his intervention, the way he had solved her problem without making it obvious that there had been a problem at all. A small smile played at the corners of her mouth, an expression of gratitude mixed with something that might have been respect. "Thank you," she said quietly, her voice carrying the particular precision of someone who had learned to speak clearly despite potential challenges with speech development. "That was very smooth." Marcus felt his heart skip at the sophisticated observation. This was clearly a child whose intelligence had been nurtured and celebrated, whose parents had ensured that her cognitive development flourished even if her physical challenges required accommodation. "You're very welcome," he replied, keeping his voice low and maintaining the pretense of table maintenance. "I hope you're enjoying the reception." The simple question seemed to surprise her, as if adults rarely asked for her opinion about social events. She considered her response carefully, her expression thoughtful. "The music is beautiful, and the flowers are arranged with mathematical precision. But I think the most interesting thing is watching how people move in patterns without realizing they're doing it." Marcus nearly dropped the cocktail napkins he was holding. The girl's observation about human movement patterns struck Marcus with the force of recognition. In all his years working with children, he had rarely encountered such sophisticated social awareness from someone so young. Her comment revealed not just intelligence, but the particular kind of observational skills that children with disabilities often developed as survival mechanisms in an unpredictable world. "You're absolutely right," Marcus replied, abandoning any pretense of table maintenance and focusing entirely on their conversation. "People do move in patterns. I've noticed that most adults here create invisible boundaries around themselves and seem uncomfortable when those boundaries overlap with yours." Her eyes widened slightly at his directness. Most adults either ignored her observations entirely or responded with patronizing praise that demonstrated they hadn't actually heard what she said. Marcus's acknowledgement of the social dynamics she had identified seemed to surprise and please her. "You see it too," she said, her voice carrying a note of relief. "My parents tell me I'm too analytical about social situations, but I think understanding patterns helps predict what people will do next. It makes navigation easier when you know where the obstacles will appear." The clinical precision of her language sent another jolt of recognition through Marcus's professional consciousness. This was the vocabulary of someone who had spent considerable time in therapeutic settings, learning to articulate her experiences with the kind of self-awareness that most adults never achieved. "That's brilliant adaptive thinking," he said, the words escaping before he could censor the professional terminology. "Your observational skills are probably more advanced than most people twice your age." Something shifted in her expression, a sharpening of attention that suggested she had detected something significant in his response. "You talk like the therapists at my rehabilitation center," she said, studying his face with new interest. "But you're working at the wedding." Marcus felt a familiar tightness in his chest, the intersection of past and present that he had been avoiding for years. The girl's perceptiveness had identified something that he had hoped would remain hidden, the remnants of his professional identity that he couldn't completely suppress even in his current role. Before he could formulate a response that would deflect her observation, her parents materialized beside them. Her father approached with the measured stride of someone accustomed to command, while her mother moved with the particular alertness of a parent whose child required constant advocacy. "Isabella," her father said, his voice warm with affection, "I see you found someone interesting to talk with. I hope you're not monopolizing this gentleman's time when he has work to do." The rebuke was gentle but carried the unconscious assumption that Marcus's interaction with their daughter was somehow inappropriate or burdensome. It was the kind of well-meaning protection that Marcus had observed countless times, parents who had learned to shield their children from potential disappointment but sometimes created isolation in the process. "Not at all," Marcus replied, maintaining the respectful tone expected from service staff while allowing a hint of his professional authority to surface. Isabella has been making some fascinating observations about social dynamics at the reception. She has remarkable analytical skills. Both parents looked surprised at the sophisticated language he used to describe their daughter's abilities. Isabella's mother studied Marcus with new interest, clearly noting the shift in his manner of speaking and the genuine respect in his voice when he addressed their daughter. "Are you studying psychology?" her mother asked, perhaps accounting for his comfort with therapeutic terminology. "You seem very knowledgeable about child development." The question hung in the air with dangerous potential. Marcus felt the weight of years of careful concealment, the protective barriers he had built around his past to ensure that his current employment remained secure. But Isabella's intelligent gaze seemed to pierce through his defenses, and her parents' genuine curiosity about his background created a moment of decision. "I have some background in that area," he said carefully, choosing words that were truthful without being revelatory. "I find that children often have insights that adults miss because they observe the world without preconceived assumptions." Isabella smiled at his diplomatic response, clearly understanding that he was protecting some kind of secret while still acknowledging her intelligence. Her father extended his hand in a gesture that seemed to elevate Marcus from service staff to conversational equal. "I'm David Meridian," he said, his handshake firm and direct. "This is my wife Catherine, and our daughter Isabella. We appreciate your kindness to her. It's not always easy for her to find genuine conversation at these events." The introduction carried weight beyond simple politeness. Marcus recognized the name from business publications and news reports, confirming his earlier assumption about the family's prominence. But more significant was the implicit acknowledgement that their daughter faced social challenges that required appreciation when someone addressed them appropriately. "Marcus Chen," he replied, accepting the handshake and noting the way David's eyes sharpened slightly at the unexpected firmness and confidence of his grip. "It's been a pleasure talking with Isabella. She has a remarkable way of seeing things that most people miss." "What part of this story resonates most deeply with you so far?" Whether you're watching someone you care about navigate social challenges, or you've experienced being overlooked yourself, we'd love to hear your thoughts. Share what's touching your heart as we continue this journey together. Catherine Meridian stepped closer to her daughter's wheelchair, her hand finding Isabella's shoulder in a gesture that spoke of years of protective advocacy. There was something in her manner that suggested recognition, as if Marcus's way of interacting with Isabella had triggered some professional memory or association. "Isabella, darling," she said, her voice carrying a note of gentle redirection, "perhaps we should let Mr. Chen return to his duties. I'm sure he has many responsibilities to attend to." The suggestion was polite but firm, carrying the subtle message that prolonged interaction between service staff and guests crossed social boundaries that needed to be maintained. Marcus felt the familiar weight of dismissal in Catherine Meridian's polite redirection, the gentle but firm reminder that he belonged in the background rather than engaging in extended conversation with prominent guests. It was a boundary he had learned to navigate carefully during his months at the country club, where stepping outside prescribed roles could result in swift unemployment. But before he could offer an appropriate response and retreat to his duties, Isabella spoke with the clear voice of someone who had learned to advocate for herself in situations where others might try to speak for her. "Actually, Mom, Mr. Chen was just explaining something really interesting about pattern recognition in social settings. It relates to what Dr. Martinez taught me about environmental scanning and adaptive responses." The clinical terminology that rolled so naturally from Isabella's lips created an unexpected bridge between Marcus's hidden expertise and the family's obvious familiarity with therapeutic intervention. Catherine's expression shifted from polite dismissal to sharp attention, her trained ear clearly recognizing the sophisticated language that her daughter was using. David Meridian's business instinct seemed to activate as well, his eyes moving between Marcus and Isabella with the calculating attention of someone who had built an empire by recognizing when situations contained more complexity than initially apparent. The way his daughter was engaging with this wedding assistant suggested undercurrents that warranted investigation. "Dr. Martinez," Catherine repeated slowly, her gaze fixed on Marcus with new intensity. "Isabella's occupational therapist at Children's Rehabilitation Center. She specializes in sensory integration and social navigation strategies for children with complex needs." The words hung in the air like a challenge, or perhaps a test. Marcus felt his carefully constructed anonymity beginning to crumble under the weight of professional recognition. These parents had clearly spent years immersed in therapeutic communities, learning specialized vocabularies and developing sophisticated understanding of their daughter's needs. Isabella seemed to sense the tension that her innocent comment had created, but rather than retreating, she leaned forward in her wheelchair with the engaged posture of someone who had detected an interesting puzzle requiring solution. Mr. Chen understands about accommodation strategies without making them obvious, she said, her voice carrying the matter-of-fact tone of someone stating observable evidence. When those men were crowding my space, he created a buffer zone while pretending to organize table settings. That's advanced intervention technique. Marcus felt his breath catch at the clinical accuracy of Isabella's analysis. She had not only recognized his professional approach but had articulated it with the precision of someone who had received years of high-quality therapeutic intervention. Her parents had clearly invested significant resources in ensuring that she understood her own needs and could communicate them effectively. Catherine's hand tightened slightly on her daughter's shoulder, a protective gesture that seemed automatic rather than conscious. Her eyes never left Marcus's face as she processed the implications of Isabella's observations. "That's a very sophisticated analysis, sweetheart," she said carefully, her voice carrying the controlled tone of someone who had learned to navigate potentially dangerous social territory. But perhaps Mr. Chen's kindness was simply natural courtesy rather than professional technique. The diplomatic phrasing was clearly designed to offer Marcus an escape route, a way to deflect the increasingly uncomfortable scrutiny without losing face. But Isabella's intelligence had already identified something that couldn't be easily dismissed, and her parents' own expertise in disability advocacy had made them sensitive to the nuances of therapeutic interaction. David stepped closer to the conversation, his corporate instincts clearly engaged by the puzzle that was unfolding. In his world, information was power, and understanding the true nature of people's capabilities could mean the difference between successful partnerships and costly mistakes. "Isabella has always been exceptionally perceptive about people's backgrounds and motivations," he said, his tone carefully neutral but his eyes sharp with interest. "She has a particular talent for recognizing when someone has experience working with children who have special needs." The statement was both observation and invitation, a chance for Marcus to acknowledge his background without having to volunteer information that might compromise his current position. But it also carried an undercurrent of parental protection, a warning that any deception or manipulation involving their daughter would be met with serious consequences. Marcus found himself at a crossroads that felt familiar despite the completely different context. During his hospital years, he had often faced moments when honesty about a child's condition or prognosis required careful navigation between hope and reality, between professional expertise and human compassion. "Isabella deserves to have her observations validated," he said finally, choosing his words with the precision that years of clinical practice had taught him. "She's right that I have some experience with accommodation strategies. My background includes work with children who face similar challenges to hers." The admission felt both liberating and terrifying, a partial revelation of the identity he had been hiding for years. But Isabella's satisfied smile and her parents' expressions of dawning understanding suggested that his honesty had been the right choice, regardless of the potential consequences. Catherine exchanged a meaningful glance with her husband, a silent communication that spoke of years of partnership in advocating for their daughter's needs. They had clearly encountered enough professionals over the years to recognize genuine expertise when they encountered it. "What kind of experience?" Catherine asked, her voice carrying the careful tone of someone who had learned to verify credentials and assess qualifications with protective thoroughness. Before Marcus could formulate a response that would satisfy their curiosity without completely exposing his vulnerability, Vivian's sharp voice cut through the conversation like a blade through silk. "Marcus," she called from across the reception area, her tone carrying the particular edge that indicated displeasure barely held in check. "I need you to assist with the dinner service transition immediately." The interruption came with perfect timing to rescue him from further revelation, but also with the unmistakable message that his extended conversation with important guests had been noticed and disapproved of. Vivian's summons carried the unmistakable authority of someone who had witnessed a boundary violation and intended to address it immediately. Marcus felt the familiar knot of anxiety that came with potential job insecurity, the constant awareness that his employment depended on maintaining invisibility and avoiding any behavior that might reflect poorly on the country club's reputation. "Please excuse me," he said to the Meridian family, his voice carefully professional despite the personal connection that had been developing. "I hope you enjoy the rest of the reception." But as he turned to leave, Isabella's clear voice stopped him with words that cut straight to the heart of what had been building between them. "Will we see you again during the evening?" she asked, her question carrying layers of meaning that transcended simple social interaction. Her parents had clearly taught her to be direct about her needs and desires, but there was something vulnerable in her tone that suggested this connection meant more to her than casual conversation. Marcus hesitated, caught between the professional obligation that Vivian's summons represented and the genuine human connection that Isabella's question revealed. In his former career, he had learned that therapeutic relationships required consistency and follow-through, that children with special needs particularly benefited from adults who honored their commitments and maintained trustworthy presence. "I'll be working throughout the evening," he replied carefully, choosing words that offered hope without making promises he might not be able to keep. "If our paths cross again, I'd be happy to continue our conversation." David Meridian stepped forward with the measured movement of someone making a calculated decision. His business instincts had clearly been activated by the interaction he had witnessed, and his protective parental instincts seemed to be aligning with curiosity about Marcus's true background. "Mr. Chen," he said, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone accustomed to being heard and obeyed, "perhaps we could arrange a more formal opportunity to continue this discussion. Isabella rarely connects with people the way she has with you today." The invitation was both generous and dangerous, offering recognition and validation that Marcus had been craving for years while potentially exposing him to scrutiny that could destroy the careful anonymity he had built around his current life. Across the reception area, Vivian's posture radiated impatience and disapproval, her tablet clutched like a weapon as she monitored his failure to respond immediately to her summons. "I appreciate that very much," Marcus replied, his training in diplomatic communication serving him well in this delicate moment. "Perhaps we can explore that possibility after I fulfill my current responsibilities." Catherine Meridian moved closer to her daughter's wheelchair, her protective instincts clearly engaged by the unusual nature of their interaction with someone whose professional background remained partially mysterious. But her expression suggested curiosity rather than suspicion, the look of someone who had learned to recognize genuine care when she encountered it. "Isabella, darling," she said gently, "perhaps we should let Mr. Chen attend to his duties now. We can continue getting to know him later this evening if the opportunity arises." But Isabella's remarkable perceptiveness had detected something in the social dynamics that the adults were trying to manage diplomatically. Her eyes moved between Marcus and the distant figure of Vivian with the analytical precision that had characterized all of her observations. "The wedding coordinator looks angry," she said with the direct honesty that children often employed before learning to soften uncomfortable truths. "Is Mr. Chen going to get in trouble for talking with us?" The question hung in the air with devastating accuracy, exposing the class and power dynamics that everyone had been carefully navigating without explicitly acknowledging. Isabella's disability had not diminished her ability to read social situations with remarkable clarity, and her question forced all the adults to confront the reality of Marcus's vulnerable position. David's expression hardened slightly, his business instincts clearly recognizing the implications of what his daughter had observed. As someone who wielded considerable economic power, he understood better than most how employment relationships could be weaponized against workers who stepped outside prescribed boundaries. "That's an excellent question," he said, his voice carrying a note of steel that suggested his protective instincts extended beyond his immediate family to include people who had shown genuine kindness to his daughter. "Perhaps the wedding coordinator needs to understand that we specifically requested extended conversation with Mr. Chen." The lie was smoothly delivered and strategically brilliant, creating a framework that would protect Marcus from professional consequences while establishing the family's authority to engage with country club staff as they saw fit. But it also represented a commitment that could have far-reaching implications for everyone involved. Marcus felt his chest tighten with a mixture of gratitude and concern. The Meridian family's willingness to protect him from Vivian's displeasure was generous beyond anything he had expected, but it also created obligations and connections that could complicate his carefully structured life. "That's very kind of you," he said, his voice thick with emotion that he struggled to control, "but I wouldn't want to create any misunderstanding about my role here or cause any inconvenience for your family." Across the reception area, Vivian had begun moving in their direction, her stride purposeful and her expression suggesting that diplomatic intervention might no longer be sufficient to address what she perceived as a serious breach of protocol. Isabella followed Marcus's gaze and immediately understood the approaching crisis. With the quick thinking that had probably served her well in navigating various challenging situations throughout her young life, she turned to her father with an expression of innocent determination. "Daddy," she said, her voice carrying the particular tone that children used when making requests they expected to be honored, "I think we should invite Mr. Chen to sit with us during dinner. I have more questions about pattern recognition, and Mom always says learning opportunities shouldn't be wasted." The request was simultaneously childlike and sophisticated, framed in language that appealed to her parents' commitment to her intellectual development while creating a social structure that would legitimize Marcus's continued presence at their table. David's smile suggested both pride in his daughter's strategic thinking and recognition of the elegant solution she had proposed to a complex problem. Vivian arrived at their small circle with the controlled urgency of someone who had spent years managing high-stakes social events where every detail could determine success or catastrophic failure. Her smile was perfectly calibrated for important guests, but Marcus could see the tension in her shoulders and the way her knuckles had gone white around her tablet. "Mr. and Mrs. Meridian," she said, her voice warm with professional courtesy while her eyes delivered a different message entirely to Marcus, "I hope you're enjoying the reception. I apologize if my assistant has been monopolizing your time when he should be attending to his duties." The apology was skillfully constructed to acknowledge the guest's importance while firmly establishing Marcus's subordinate position and suggesting that his prolonged interaction with them represented a failure of appropriate boundaries. It was exactly the kind of diplomatic reprimand that Marcus had learned to expect and accept during his months of service work. But David Meridian's response carried the quiet authority of someone who was accustomed to controlling conversations rather than being managed by them. His business instincts had clearly identified an opportunity to assert dominance while protecting someone who had shown genuine care for his daughter. "Actually, miss," he began, deliberately avoiding her name to establish social distance, "we specifically requested extended time with Mr. Chen. My daughter has special needs, and we found his approach to accommodation remarkably sophisticated. We were hoping to arrange for him to join our table during dinner so we can continue our discussion." Vivian's practiced smile flickered for just a moment as she processed the unexpected reversal of power dynamics. In her carefully ordered world, wedding assistants did not receive dinner invitations from billionaire CEOs, and important guests did not specifically request the company of service staff. "I'm sure that's very generous of you," she said, her voice maintaining professional warmth while her mind clearly raced to calculate the implications of this unprecedented situation, "but Marcus has specific responsibilities throughout the evening that require his attention. Perhaps we could arrange for one of our senior staff members to assist with any special accommodations your daughter might need." The suggestion was reasonable and appropriately deferential, but it completely missed the point of what had been developing between Marcus and Isabella. Catherine Meridian stepped forward with the measured grace of someone who had spent years advocating for her daughter's needs in situations where institutional responses often fell short of actual requirements. "That's thoughtful," she said, her tone carrying the particular firmness that mothers developed when protecting their children's interests, "but Isabella has connected with Mr. Chen in a way that's quite rare. As I'm sure you understand, children with disabilities often have very specific social needs that can't be addressed by simply assigning generic assistance." Isabella herself had been listening to this adult negotiation with the focused attention of someone who understood that her own desires were being discussed and potentially decided without her input. With the directness that her parents had clearly encouraged, she inserted herself into the conversation with the confidence of someone who had learned to advocate for her own needs. "Mr. Chen understands about environmental scanning and adaptive responses," she said, her clinical vocabulary precisely deployed to establish the sophistication of their interaction. "Most people try to help me by doing things for me, but he creates conditions where I can help myself. That's advanced therapeutic technique. The impact of Isabella's articulate explanation was immediate and undeniable. Even Vivian, whose primary concern was maintaining appropriate social boundaries, could not dismiss the clear preference of a child with special needs who had found someone capable of understanding her requirements in ways that transcended simple courtesy. Marcus watched this advocacy unfold with a mixture of gratitude and growing anxiety. The Meridian family's protection was generous beyond anything he had expected, but their intervention was also exposing him to exactly the kind of attention that he had been working to avoid. Vivian's sharp intelligence had clearly detected that something about this situation extended beyond typical guest-staff interaction. "Well," she said slowly, her voice carefully controlled as she navigated this unexpected challenge to her authority, "if the Meridian family has specifically requested Mr. Chen's continued assistance, perhaps we can arrange for modified duties that would allow him to accommodate their needs while still fulfilling his essential responsibilities." The compromise was diplomatically constructed to save face for everyone involved while acknowledging the reality that challenging the wishes of prominent guests would create problems far more significant than any breach of normal protocol. But Marcus could see in her expression that this unusual arrangement would come with consequences that extended beyond the current evening. David seemed to recognize the delicate position that Vivian was being forced to navigate, and his response carried the kind of gracious authority that successful business leaders learn to employ when achieving objectives while allowing others to maintain dignity. "We appreciate your flexibility," he said, his tone acknowledging her accommodation while making it clear that their request was not actually negotiable. "I'm sure Mr. Chen can balance his professional obligations with our family's particular needs. We've found that excellent service often requires exactly this kind of personalized attention." The phrasing was brilliant in its implications, suggesting that Marcus's extended interaction with their family represented superior rather than inappropriate service, and that any attempt to curtail it would actually diminish the quality of care that important guests had come to expect from Rosewood Country Club. Isabella beamed at her father's diplomatic victory, clearly understanding that the adults had successfully navigated a complex social challenge that would allow her to continue developing her connection with someone who treated her with genuine respect and professional understanding. But as Vivian retreated with carefully maintained composure to reorganize the evening's logistics around this unexpected development, Marcus felt the weight of scrutiny that would inevitably follow. His carefully constructed anonymity was beginning to crumble, and the protection of powerful allies came with visibility that could ultimately threaten the security he had built for himself and Danny. The dinner service began with the choreographed precision that Marcus had helped orchestrate throughout the day, but now he found himself experiencing it from an entirely different perspective. Instead of serving from the background, he was seated at table 12 with the Meridian family, his presence legitimized by their explicit request but still feeling surreal after months of careful invisibility. The country club had arranged for a modified place setting that accommodated his dual role, allowing him to respond to any urgent service needs while participating in dinner conversation. It was an elegant solution that preserved everyone's dignity while acknowledging the unusual circumstances that had developed throughout the day. Isabella had positioned her wheelchair at the round table in a way that allowed her to engage easily with all the other guests while maintaining clear sight lines to the dance floor and wedding party. Her parents flanked her with the protective awareness that Marcus recognized from years of working with families who had learned to navigate social situations where their child's needs required constant consideration. The other guests at their table were carefully chosen allies, Marcus realized. A pediatric surgeon and her husband, a family law attorney who specialized in disability rights, and an older couple whose adult son had cerebral palsy. These were people who understood Isabella's world and could engage with her as a complete person rather than a curiosity or object of pity. As the first course was served, Isabella began demonstrating the sophisticated social skills that her parents had clearly invested years in developing. She asked thoughtful questions about the other guests' work and shared observations about the wedding that revealed both intelligence and emotional maturity far beyond her years. "Dr. Patterson," she said to the pediatric surgeon, "my occupational therapist mentioned that surgical techniques for spinal conditions have improved significantly in recent years. Are you seeing better outcomes for children with mobility challenges?" The question was precisely calibrated to engage professional expertise while demonstrating her own knowledge of medical terminology and current treatment approaches. Dr. Patterson's face lit up with the expression that specialists wore when encountering truly informed patients or families. "We're seeing remarkable progress, especially with minimally invasive approaches that preserve more natural function," she replied, her tone carrying the respect that medical professionals showed when discussing complex cases with knowledgeable families. "The key is early intervention and comprehensive rehabilitation that addresses not just physical limitations but cognitive and social development as well." Marcus listened to this exchange with growing admiration for Isabella's sophisticated understanding of her own condition and treatment options. Her parents had clearly ensured that she was an informed participant in her own care rather than a passive recipient of adult decisions. But it was during the second course that something extraordinary happened. Isabella was attempting to cut her chicken with adaptive utensils that allowed her to maintain independence despite fine motor challenges. The task required concentration and careful coordination, and Marcus could see the slight frustration building as she worked to achieve clean cuts without assistance. Without conscious thought, his professional training took over. He began providing what occupational therapists called environmental modification, subtly adjusting the angle of her plate to optimize her cutting leverage and repositioning her water glass to reduce reach distance. His movements were so natural and unobtrusive that they appeared to be simple table courtesies rather than calculated therapeutic interventions. Isabella noticed immediately, of course. Her eyes met his with a look of recognition and gratitude that spoke volumes about her experience with adults who either did everything for her or ignored her struggles entirely. Marcus had found the precise middle ground that honored her independence while providing the minimal support that maximized her success. "That was perfectly calibrated assistance," she said quietly, her voice carrying the clinical precision that had characterized all their interactions. "You provided environmental modification without compromising my autonomy. That requires significant training and experience." Her parents had been engaged in conversation with Dr. Patterson about hospital administration, but Isabella's comment drew their immediate attention. Catherine's eyes moved from her daughter's successfully managed plate to Marcus's face with dawning recognition of what she had witnessed. "Marcus," she said slowly, her voice carrying the particular tone that parents used when significant realizations were beginning to crystallize, "Isabella is right about the sophistication of what you just did. That wasn't casual helpfulness. That was professional-level occupational therapy technique." The observation hung in the air like a challenge or perhaps an invitation. Marcus felt the careful barriers he had constructed around his past beginning to crumble under the weight of recognition that could no longer be deflected or dismissed. His therapeutic instincts had betrayed him, revealing expertise that he had spent years trying to suppress. David leaned forward with the focused attention that had probably served him well in countless business negotiations where accurate assessment of people's capabilities determined success or failure. His expression suggested that pieces of a puzzle were falling into place in ways that confirmed suspicions he had been developing throughout the day. "I think," he said carefully, his voice carrying the authority of someone who was accustomed to directing important conversations, "that we need to have a more complete discussion about your background, Mr. Chen. Isabella deserves to understand exactly who she's been talking with, and frankly, so do we." The request was both reasonable and terrifying, offering the possibility of honest connection while threatening the security that Marcus had built through careful concealment. Around the table, the other guests had begun to notice the intensity of the conversation developing between the Meridian family and their unexpected dinner companion. Isabella herself seemed to sense the significance of the moment that was unfolding. Her intelligent eyes moved between her parents and Marcus with the analytical attention that had characterized all her observations throughout the day. "Mr. Chen has been hiding something important," she said with the directness that children often employed before learning to soften difficult truths. "But I think it's something good, not something bad. People who understand therapeutic techniques the way he does usually want to help children like me." Her insight was devastating in its accuracy, cutting through adult diplomatic complexity to identify the essential truth that Marcus had been struggling to protect. The weight of Isabella's perceptive observation settled over the table like a gentle but insistent pressure, demanding honesty that Marcus had been avoiding for years. Around them, the wedding reception continued with its carefully orchestrated joy, but their small circle had become an island of intensity where truth was quietly but relentlessly being pursued. Dr. Patterson leaned forward with the clinical interest that medical professionals displayed when encountering intriguing cases or unexpected expertise. Her trained eye had clearly detected the same professional competence that the Meridian family was beginning to recognize. "Isabella's assessment is quite accurate," she said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had worked with countless therapeutic specialists throughout her career. "The environmental modifications I observed weren't random acts of kindness. They demonstrated specific knowledge of occupational therapy protocols and sensory integration techniques." Marcus felt his carefully constructed defenses crumbling under the combined scrutiny of people whose professional experience made them impossible to deceive. The irony wasn't lost on him that his own expertise, the very thing he had been trying to hide, was being recognized by others who possessed similar knowledge. Catherine reached across the table to place her hand gently over his, a gesture that carried both compassion and determination. Her years of advocating for Isabella had clearly taught her to recognize when important conversations needed to happen, regardless of how uncomfortable they might be for all parties involved. "Marcus," she said softly, her voice carrying the particular warmth that mothers used when they sensed vulnerability that needed protection, "we're not trying to put you in an uncomfortable position. But Isabella rarely connects with people the way she has with you today, and as her parents, we need to understand why." The request was both reasonable and devastating, acknowledging his right to privacy while making it clear that continued interaction with their daughter would require transparency about his qualifications and background. It was exactly the kind of protective questioning that Marcus would have employed himself when evaluating adults who wanted to work with vulnerable children. Isabella herself seemed to understand the delicate nature of what was happening. Her intelligent eyes moved between her parents and Marcus with the analytical attention that had characterized all her observations, but her expression also carried a hint of concern that suggested she was worried about pushing him too hard. "I don't want to make Mr. Chen uncomfortable," she said, her voice carrying the careful consideration that children with disabilities often developed when navigating adult relationships that might be fragile or conditional. "But I would like to understand why he knows so much about helping people like me." Her diplomatic phrasing offered Marcus another opportunity to deflect or minimize, but the genuine curiosity in her voice and the protective concern in her parents' faces made further evasion feel not just dishonest but cruel. These people had extended trust and protection to him throughout the day, and they deserved honesty in return. David set down his wine glass with the deliberate movement of someone who was preparing to take control of a conversation that had been dancing around essential truths for too long. His business instincts had clearly identified this as a moment when direct action was required. "Let me ask a more specific question," he said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who was accustomed to getting answers to important inquiries. "Do you have professional credentials in occupational therapy or a related field? Because what we've observed today goes far beyond casual familiarity with disability accommodation." The question was precisely targeted and impossible to deflect without outright dishonesty. Marcus felt his chest tighten with the familiar sensation that came with moments of significant decision, when paths diverged and choices carried consequences that couldn't be undone. He thought of Danny, probably finishing his evening therapy exercises with Mrs. Rodriguez, struggling with homework that challenged his processing abilities but approaching each task with the determined optimism that Marcus had worked to nurture despite their difficult circumstances. Everything he had done for the past several years had been motivated by his need to provide stability and security for his son. But sitting across from Isabella, whose intelligence and resilience reminded him so powerfully of the children he had once dedicated his life to helping, Marcus realized that continued deception wasn't just dishonest but potentially harmful. She deserved to understand why their connection felt so natural and meaningful. "Yes," he said quietly, the word carrying the weight of years of careful concealment finally being abandoned. "I have a doctorate in occupational therapy with specialization in pediatric sensory integration and adaptive technology. I spent 8 years working at Children's Hospital before I came here." The admission felt both liberating and terrifying, a revelation that stripped away the protective anonymity he had built around his current life while acknowledging the professional identity that he had never truly abandoned. Around the table, expressions shifted from curiosity to understanding as pieces of a complex puzzle suddenly fell into place. Isabella's face lit up with the satisfied expression of someone whose analytical instincts had been validated. Her parents exchanged glances that spoke of recognition and perhaps relief that their daughter's unusual connection with a wedding assistant now made perfect sense. Dr. Patterson nodded with the professional approval that specialists showed when encountering respected colleagues in unexpected contexts. The disability rights attorney leaned forward with interest that suggested legal and advocacy implications were beginning to crystallize in his mind. But it was Catherine's response that carried the most emotional weight, her voice soft with understanding and perhaps a hint of sadness for whatever circumstances had led someone with Marcus's qualifications to work in such a different capacity. "What happened?" she asked gently, her question acknowledging that transitions from prestigious medical careers to service work didn't happen without significant life changes that were probably painful to discuss. Before Marcus could formulate a response that would explain without revealing too much personal vulnerability, the evening's carefully orchestrated schedule intervened in a way that would change everything. Before Marcus could answer Catherine's gentle inquiry about his career transition, a commotion erupted near the dance floor that immediately commanded everyone's attention. A young boy, perhaps 6 years old, had apparently become overwhelmed by the sensory intensity of the reception and was experiencing what Marcus instantly recognized as a severe meltdown. The child was on the ground, his small body rigid with distress as he screamed with the particular intensity that came from complete sensory overload. The music, lights, crowd noise, and social pressure had clearly exceeded his ability to cope, and his nervous system was essentially shutting down in response to overwhelming stimulation. Adults clustered around him with the helpless concern that well-meaning people displayed when confronted with childhood crises they didn't understand. Someone had turned off the music, which only seemed to intensify the child's distress as the sudden change added another jarring element to his already overloaded sensory experience. Marcus was on his feet before conscious thought could intervene, his professional training overriding years of careful self-concealment. Every instinct that had made him exceptional at his former career was suddenly roaring back to life, demanding action regardless of personal consequences. Isabella's sharp intake of breath told him that she had immediately understood the significance of what was happening. Her own experience with sensory challenges had taught her to recognize when other children were experiencing neurological overwhelm that required specific intervention rather than generic comfort. "That sensory overload," she said urgently, her clinical vocabulary precisely deployed to describe what she was witnessing. "He needs environmental reduction and proprioceptive input, not more stimulation from people trying to help." Her parents looked between their daughter and Marcus with dawning understanding that this moment would reveal whether his claimed expertise was genuine or fabricated. Dr. Patterson was already moving toward the crisis, her medical training compelling her to assist, but Marcus could see from her hesitant approach that pediatric sensory integration wasn't her specialty. Marcus reached the distressed child ahead of the other adults, his movement swift but calm as he automatically began implementing protocols that he hadn't used professionally in years but that remained embedded in his muscle memory like a native language. He knelt beside the boy but didn't immediately touch him, understanding that unwanted physical contact could escalate rather than soothe sensory overwhelm. Instead, he began speaking in the low, rhythmic tone that he had learned could penetrate the chaos of a meltdown without adding to the child's auditory stress. "Hey buddy," he said softly, his voice carrying the particular cadence that experienced therapists developed for these exact situations. "I can see that everything feels too much right now. We're going to make it quieter and calmer, okay?" The child's screaming didn't immediately stop, but Marcus could see the slight shift in his posture that indicated his words were being processed despite the ongoing distress. Years of experience had taught him to read the subtle signs that showed when intervention was beginning to take effect. Without looking away from the child, Marcus addressed the crowd of concerned adults who were inadvertently making the situation worse through their presence and attention. "I need everyone to step back about 10 feet and lower your voices to whispers," he said, his tone carrying the quiet authority that came from genuine expertise in crisis intervention. "He's experiencing sensory overload, and additional stimulation will prolong his distress." The adults complied immediately, responding to the confident competence in his voice. Vivian appeared at the edge of the circle, her tablet forgotten as she witnessed her wedding assistant taking command of a situation that could have escalated into a public relations disaster. Marcus turned his attention back to the child, who had begun the gradual transition from complete overwhelm to manageable distress. This was the critical moment when proper intervention could either restore regulation or trigger a secondary meltdown that would be even more difficult to address. "Can you feel your feet on the ground?" he asked gently, beginning the grounding sequence that helped overwhelmed nervous systems reconnect with physical reality. "Let's take some deep breaths together and count how many slow heartbeats we can feel." The technique was called coregulation, using his own calm nervous system to help guide the child's dysregulated state back toward baseline functioning. It was advanced therapeutic intervention that required not just knowledge but intuitive understanding of how trauma and overwhelm affected developing brains. From her position at the dinner table, Isabella watched with fascination as Marcus demonstrated exactly the kind of expertise that she had suspected throughout their day of interaction. Her parents observed with growing amazement as they witnessed professional competence that validated everything their daughter had intuited about his background. The child's breathing began to slow and deepen as Marcus's intervention took effect. His rigid posture started to soften, and the desperate quality of his crying shifted toward the more manageable distress that indicated his nervous system was coming back online. "That's exactly right," Marcus said encouragingly, maintaining the calm presence that would help consolidate the child's return to regulation. "You're doing such a good job of helping your body feel safe again." A woman who had been watching from the crowd stepped forward with the particular urgency that identified her as the boy's mother. Her face carried the exhaustion and anxiety that parents of children with special needs knew intimately, the constant vigilance required to prevent or manage exactly these kinds of public crises. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with gratitude and relief. "He has autism and sensory processing disorder. I should have seen the signs building, but everything was so overwhelming today." Marcus looked up at her with the compassionate understanding that came from years of supporting families through similar challenges. His professional identity was now fully engaged, all pretense of being merely a wedding assistant completely abandoned. "You couldn't have prevented this," he said gently, his words carrying the authority of someone who understood both the neurological and emotional complexities of raising children with special needs. Large social events are inherently challenging for kids with sensory differences. What matters is that he's safe and recovering now. As the child's breathing returned to normal and his body relaxed into genuine calm, Marcus helped him transition to a seated position against the wall where reduced visual stimulation would support continued regulation. The entire intervention had taken less than 10 minutes, but it had completely transformed not just the immediate crisis but everyone's understanding of who Marcus really was. As the child's breathing returned to normal and the immediate crisis passed, a profound silence settled over the reception area. The guests who had witnessed Marcus's professional intervention looked at him with expressions that ranged from amazement to newfound respect, but it was the reaction of the Meridian family that carried the most significance. David approached with the measured stride of someone who had just witnessed capabilities that completely reframed his understanding of a situation. His business instincts had clearly shifted from curiosity to recognition of exceptional talent that was being dramatically underutilized. "Dr. Chen," he said, deliberately using the title that Marcus had earned but abandoned, "what we just witnessed was extraordinary. That level of expertise doesn't develop overnight, and it certainly doesn't belong in a service position at a country club." The weight of his words carried implications that extended far beyond simple acknowledgement of professional competence. This was a man who built empires by recognizing and cultivating exceptional ability, and he had just witnessed skills that could transform lives if properly deployed. Isabella had maneuvered her wheelchair closer to where Marcus knelt beside the now calm child, her eyes bright with the satisfaction of someone whose analytical instincts had been completely validated. Her connection with him throughout the day suddenly made perfect sense, a recognition between two people who understood the challenges of navigating a world that didn't always accommodate different needs. "You help children like me," she said, her voice carrying a note of wonder that suggested the full significance of their interaction was only now becoming clear to her. "That's why you understood about accommodation strategies and environmental scanning. You've been helping kids with disabilities your whole career." Marcus felt tears threatening as he looked at Isabella's radiant expression. In her face, he He saw reflections of all the children he had worked with over the years, the countless young people whose potential had been unlocked through patient intervention and advocacy. He had walked away from that calling to protect his own child, but sitting here surrounded by proof of his impact, he wondered if the cost of that sacrifice had been higher than he realized. Catherine moved to stand beside her husband, her maternal instincts clearly engaged by the story that was unfolding. Years of advocating for Isabella had taught her to recognize when life-changing opportunities presented themselves, often in the most unexpected circumstances. "Marcus," she said gently, her voice carrying the particular warmth that came from genuine understanding, "I think you need to tell us what really happened. How does someone with your qualifications and obvious passion for this work end up arranging flowers at weddings?" The question was both compassionate and direct, acknowledging his right to privacy while making it clear that continued connection would require honest explanation. Around them, the reception was slowly returning to normal as guests resumed their conversations and the band prepared to restart the music. Marcus looked down at the child who was now resting peacefully against the wall, his crisis completely resolved through intervention that had drawn on years of specialized training and experience. The sight triggered memories of countless similar moments when his expertise had made the difference between overwhelm and regulation, between isolation and connection. "My wife died in a car accident 4 years ago," he said quietly, the words carrying weight that had accumulated through years of suppressed grief. "She left me with our son Danny, who has cerebral palsy and requires extensive daily care. The medical bills and childcare costs made it impossible to continue working full-time at the hospital." The simple explanation contained layers of sacrifice and loss that resonated powerfully with parents who understood the lengths that love could drive someone to travel. David's expression shifted from business assessment to human recognition, while Catherine's eyes reflected the particular empathy that came from understanding how disability could reshape entire family systems. "I took this job because it offers flexibility and allows me to be home every evening for Danny's therapy sessions," Marcus continued, his voice growing stronger as he acknowledged truths he had been carrying alone for years. "The pay is much less, but it means I can be the father he needs while still contributing to our household income." Isabella listened to this explanation with the focused attention that she had given to everything throughout their day together. Her young mind was clearly processing not just the practical implications of his choices but the emotional complexity of a parent who had sacrificed professional fulfillment for family responsibility. "You gave up helping lots of children so you could focus on helping your own child," she observed, her clinical vocabulary once again precisely deployed to articulate complex emotional realities. "That's what good parents do when their kids need them." Her matter-of-fact acceptance of his choices carried more validation than any professional recognition he had ever received. This remarkable young person understood sacrifice and dedication in ways that many adults never achieved, and her approval felt like absolution for years of questioning whether he had made the right decision. David exchanged a meaningful glance with his wife, a silent communication that spoke of shared understanding and joint decision-making. His next words would change everything for Marcus and potentially for countless children who could benefit from his expertise. "Dr. Chen," he said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who was accustomed to making decisions that affected many lives, "I'd like to discuss an opportunity with you. Meridian Industries has been developing a comprehensive accessibility initiative that requires exactly your combination of clinical expertise and real-world understanding of family challenges." The offer hung in the air with transformative potential, promising not just financial security but a return to meaningful work that could honor both his professional calling and his parental responsibilities. Marcus felt his chest tighten with possibility that seemed too significant to be real. If this story has touched your heart, we'd love to know where in the world you're listening from. Whether you're a parent making sacrifices for your children, someone who's felt overlooked or undervalued, or simply someone who believes in the power of recognition and second chances, please subscribe and share your thoughts. Your connection to these stories helps build a community where everyone's worth is seen and celebrated. As the wedding reception resumed around them and the evening continued with renewed joy, Marcus realized that sometimes the most extraordinary transformations began with the simplest act of seeing another person's true worth and responding with genuine care.